My father looked me in the eye and said, "Leave." 20 minutes later, he wished he hadn't. My father pulled me aside at 7:43 in the evening in a carpeted hallway outside a private dining room at a restaurant I could never have afforded on my own, and he told me to leave. Not loudly. That's the thing I keep coming back to. He wasn't angry, wasn't flustered, wasn't even particularly emotional about it. He was calm the way people are calm when they've already made a decision and are simply communicating it. He put his hand briefly on my elbow, stared me a few feet from the door, and said, very quietly, "I think it would be better for everyone if you headed home before this gets started. I'll call you tomorrow. I'll call you tomorrow." Like he was rescheduling a dentist appointment. Like he was managing a minor scheduling conflict rather than asking his daughter to disappear from an event she had driven 90 minutes to attend because she'd been specifically personally invited to it 3 weeks earlier. I stood there in that carpeted hallway and looked at my father, really looked at him, the way you look at someone when you're trying to understand how you got here. And I said, "You're serious." He said, "I just think tonight isn't the right time." I said, "The right time for what?" He looked at the door, back at me. He said, "There are important people in there, Nadia. People I've been cultivating relationships with for a long time. I just need tonight to go smoothly." There it was. Not dressed up, not softened any further, just laid out plainly in the carpeted hallway of an expensive restaurant. Important people. Tonight needs to go smoothly. And his daughter, 33 years old, a person who had driven 90 minutes because he'd called me himself and said he wanted me there, was a variable in the smooth that he was trying to eliminate. I almost left. I want to be honest about that because if I tell you I stood there and immediately knew what to do, I'd be lying. There was a long moment where every instinct I'd spent 33 years developing told me to do what I'd always done. Absorb it, comply, make myself smaller, drive home, cry in the car, call my best friend, and process it for 3 days. That was the practiced response. That was the one I knew how to do. Instead, I said, "I'll find my own seat." And I walked past him and through the door. I heard him say my name behind me. I kept walking. Let me tell you about my father, because he doesn't make sense without context, and I've been trying to make him make sense for most of my life, so I have a lot of context. His name is Gerald. He is 61 years old. He grew up without much, a fact he references often, and with the particular pride of someone who has converted a difficult origin story into a personality and built himself, through a combination of genuine intelligence and relentless networking and an ability to read rooms that borders on supernatural, into a successful commercial real estate developer. He has money now, real money, the kind that comes with a certain lifestyle and a certain set of friends, and a certain understanding of how the world works and who matters in it. I am his daughter from his first marriage. His first marriage lasted 7 years and ended when I was 4, and my mother raised me largely alone because my father's relationship with me has always been conducted at the temperature he found convenient. Not absent exactly. He showed up to things, called on birthdays, sent checks for school that arrived irregularly, and always felt slightly like he was paying off a debt rather than investing in a person. But present in the way a recurring character is present rather than in the way a parent is present. He was in my life the way weather is in your life, occasionally significant, not really something you could talk to. He remarried when I was 11. Her name is Pamela, and she is fine. I say that with genuine neutrality, not as a coded insult. She is perfectly pleasant, not cruel to me, not warm either, just professionally cordial in the way stepmothers sometimes are when they've made a private decision not to engage deeply with the pre-existing children. They have 2 sons together, my half-brothers, who are 24 and 21 and who have grown up in the version of my father's life that has the money and the house and the consistent presence. I love them in the complicated way you love people who have the thing you wanted, without anyone asking whether that was fair. My relationship with my father over the last decade has been exactly what he shaped it to be. Occasional, surface-level, transactional, in a way that neither of us ever named directly. He'd call when something was happening in his life he wanted to share. I'd attend events when invited. We'd have dinners twice a year that felt like business meetings between people who had read each other's Wikipedia pages but hadn't done much additional research. I had long since stopped expecting more than that. I'd done the therapy, done the grieving, done the work of accepting that the father I had was not the father I would have chosen, and built a life that didn't require his consistent presence to be functional and good. So when he called me 3 weeks before the dinner and said he wanted me there, specifically me, he made that clear, said he had been thinking about having me more involved in his life, and this felt like a good place to start. I felt the thing you feel when you've stopped expecting something, and then it arrives anyway. Cautious. careful, but also, underneath the caution, something younger and more vulnerable that I don't particularly want to admit to. Something that said, maybe. Maybe this is the beginning of something different. I drove 90 minutes. I bought a new dress. I practiced being easy and warm and not carrying any of the weight of the history into the room. Because that's the work you do when you want to give something a real chance. And he met me in the hallway and told me to leave. The dining room was a private event space attached to a high-end restaurant, the kind of room that gets reserved for milestone celebrations and business dinners where the subtext is money. Round tables, low lighting, probably 40 people total. His business partners, some city council members he'd been cultivating, a property developer from out of state he'd mentioned several times on the phone as someone significant. This was a professional social event, the kind my father lived for, the kind where relationships get cemented over expensive wine and the performance of ease. I walked in and found an empty seat at a table near the middle of the room. A woman named Sandra was seated next to me. She introduced herself as the wife of one of my father's longtime partners. And she was warm and immediately curious in the way genuinely social people are. And within about 4 minutes, we were having a real conversation about her daughter who was considering a career change, which is actually something I know about because I'm a career counselor. That's what I do. I help people navigate professional transitions, which requires a lot of listening and a lot of reading people and a lot of patience, which are skills I developed young for reasons I've already explained. I could feel my father across the room, not looking at me. He was too careful for that, but aware of me in the way you're aware of something you're trying not to look at. He was working the room with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this for decades, moving from group to group, hand on the shoulder, real laugh deployed at strategic intervals. I watched him and I thought, not for the first time, that I had inherited his ability to read rooms. I just used it differently. The dinner was served. I ate. I talked to Sandra and to the man on my other side, a city planner named Robert, who had opinions about urban development that he was very willing to share. I was fine. I was actually fine. Not performing fine, not white knuckling through it, but genuinely okay. Because I had made a decision to be there, and I was there, and the food was good, and Sandra was genuinely lovely company. And then, about 20 minutes after I'd sat down, the program began. My father stood up. He had a microphone, not a formal thing, just the kind of handheld mic that gets passed around at these events, and he welcomed everyone, thanked them for coming, said some things about partnerships and shared vision that were polished and sincere in equal measure. He was good at this. I will always give him that. He commanded a room in a way that made you feel included in something. Then he said he wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the people in his life who had shaped who he was. He thanked his business partners by name. He thanked the city council members. He thanked Pamela, who was seated at the head table, and she smiled the practiced smile of a woman who has heard her husband give a version of this speech many times. He thanked his sons, called them both by name, said something specific and warm about each of them. I watched this and felt the familiar low-grade ache of being uncounted, the one I'd been feeling in various forms for most of my life. And I breathed through it the way you breathe through something you've learned to manage. And then he paused. Something shifted in his face. A small thing, a hesitation, a recalibration. He looked out at the room and his eyes found me, and they stayed. He said, "There is someone here tonight I wasn't sure would come." The room was quiet in the listening way. He said, "My daughter Nadia." He looked directly at me. "She drove 90 minutes to be here tonight, and He stopped. He actually stopped mid-sentence in front of 40 people, and I watched something move across his face that I did not have a category for. Not the polished version of emotion he deployed at events. Something unscripted. Something that cost him something to let into the room. I haven't been the father she deserved. I've known that for a long time, and I haven't done enough about it, and I'm not sure why I thought tonight would be a good opportunity to try to start, but here we are." The room was completely silent. He said, "Nadia, I'm glad you stayed." I sat very still. Sandra beside me had gone quiet in that particular way people go quiet when they understand they are witnessing something private made public and they don't want to disturb it. Robert on my other side had set down his fork. I looked at my father standing at the front of that room, 61 years old, the handheld microphone loose in his hand, and I thought about the hallway. The elbow. I'll call you tomorrow. I thought about the dress I'd bought and the 90 minutes I'd driven and the 33 years I'd spent adjusting my expectations downward to accommodate a man who had never once adjusted himself upward to meet me. I thought about the thing he didn't know, which was what I almost did. How close I came to walking out of that hallway and back to my car and driving home and never telling him what that ask had cost me. How the only reason I hadn't was some stubborn, exhausted, almost irrational refusal to disappear one more time. He said, I'd like to do better. If you'll let me. 40 people were looking at me. I took a breath. I said loudly enough to carry without shouting, I'll let you. That was it. 3 words. The room exhaled. Someone started clapping, and then everyone was clapping, and my father put the microphone down, and my father, who I have seen emotional exactly twice in my conscious memory, pressed his hand over his mouth for a second before he composed himself and nodded at me across the room. Sandra put her hand briefly on mine and said, Good for you, sweetheart. Robert picked his fork back up and went back to his food, which I appreciated enormously. I sat there and breathed and felt about 15 different things at once and didn't try to sort them all out because there wasn't space for that in the middle of 40 people and the rest of the dinner still to get through. My father came to find me after, when the room was loosening up and people were moving around and the event portion was winding down. He walked over and stood next to my chair and said, Can we talk for a minute? We found a quieter corner. He looked for possibly the first time in my memory, like a man who didn't know how to proceed in the social situation. It was disorienting. He said, I asked you to leave tonight. I said, I know. He said, I'm ashamed of that. I looked at him. He met my eyes and didn't look away, which was harder for him than it sounds. My father has spent his whole life looking at rooms rather than people, managing angles rather than confronting them. He said, I was afraid I don't know what I was afraid of, that it would be complicated, that people would ask questions I didn't have good answers to. He paused. That's not a good reason. I said, No, it isn't. He said, When I saw you sitting there talking to Sandra like you'd known her for years, I realized. He stopped, started again. You've always been fine without me, more than fine. And I think I'd let that become a reason not to try, which is the wrong way around. I thought about this, about how neatly it explained 33 years of exactly the kind of contact that required nothing from him. I thought about how easy it is to confuse someone's resilience with not needing you, and how that confusion is usually more convenient than inconvenient for the person doing the confusing. I said, I wasn't fine. I was just good at looking fine. There's a difference. He nodded slowly. He said, I know. I think I've always known. We stood in the corner of that room for another 20 minutes and talked more honestly than we had in possibly ever. Not a healing, not a resolution, not the beginning of a movie where everything is going to be different now. Just 2 people finally using the same language after decades of speaking around each other. It was uncomfortable and overdue and real in a way that our previous conversations had never quite managed to be. He hugged me when I left. A real hug, not the side squeeze we've been doing for years. He held on for a second, and I let him, and I drove home with the windows down even though it was cold because I needed the air and the noise and the feeling of moving through something. That was 4 months ago. My father and I talk on the phone now, not every Sunday the way my grandmother and I used to, but regularly. Real calls, not the transactional check-ins we used to have. He asks about my work. He asked last week about a client situation I'd mentioned the week before, which means he remembered, which means he was listening, which is not something I could have said about him 6 months ago. We had dinner last month, just the 2 of us, at a regular restaurant, nothing fancy. We talked for 3 hours. He told me things about his own father I'd never heard before, things that explained some of what I'd always experienced from him without excusing it, which is a distinction that matters. I told him things I'd been carrying for a long time, said them plainly without softening them, and he sat with them instead of deflecting. He's trying. Imperfectly, inconsistently, but trying in a way that is visible and real. I'm trying to, not to rebuild something that was never fully built, but to build something new from where we actually are, which requires accepting where we actually are instead of grieving where we should have been. That's harder than it sounds. Some days I sit with the phone in my hand before I call him and feel the old familiar weight of all of it, all 33 years of managed distance and adjusted expectations, and I have to make a conscious choice to dial anyway. I make the choice. Not because the past doesn't matter, it does, it will always matter, but because I'm 33 years old and I have watched what happens when people don't make that choice. When the years go by and the conversation stays surface level, and then someone is standing in front of 40 people with a microphone realizing all the things they didn't say while they still had time. I don't want to be on either side of that. Here's the thing about the hallway. He asked me to leave because he was afraid of what I represented in that room. The complication of me. The history of me. The version of his life that didn't fit the image he'd spent decades constructing. I was, to him in that moment, a variable he hadn't accounted for and didn't know how to manage. And I walked past him and through the door, not because I was brave, not because I had a plan, but because I was tired. Tired of disappearing. Tired of disappearing. Tired of shrinking down to a size that fit inside someone else's comfort. Tired of getting in my car and driving away and calling my best friend and processing it for 3 days. I had done all of that so many times for so many years, and I was simply completely finished. He stood up in front of 40 people and said her name and said I wasn't sure she'd come and said I haven't been the father she deserved. He said it out loud in a room full of people he'd spent years performing for. That cost him something real. I know enough about my father to know how much it cost him, and I'm not going to pretend it didn't matter. But here's what I want to say clearly, because I think it matters. What changed that night wasn't him telling the room he was sorry. What changed was me not leaving when he asked. What changed was the moment in the hallway when I decided, for the first time in 33 years, that my presence didn't require his permission. That I had driven 90 minutes and bought a dress and shown up, and showing up was its own complete act, regardless of what he did with it. He wished he hadn't asked me to leave. That's in the title, and it's true. But the more important thing, the thing I think about when I pick up the phone on the days it feels heavy, is that I'm glad I didn't listen. I stayed. That was mine. That one was entirely mine.